The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to select the first image that I want to work on. Let's bring this up in size a little bit. This is a long exposure, about 64 seconds long, so it gets that nice flowy water to it. The one thing that I run into all the time when I'm photographing landscapes, and especially here in Oregon because we have very few days where the weather is actually nice, is you don't really get to control what the sky looks like. And to me, the sky, and especially the appearance of clouds, has a great deal to do with the overall appearance of the image. So I'm kind of known for swapping out skies quite a bit, and there's tools in the Perfect Photo Suite that make that really easy to do. So let's go through and we're going to show you how to put in a more dynamic looking sky into this image and then convert it to a very compelling classic black and white. First thing I need to do is I need to get my image from Lightroom over to the Perfect Photo Suite. And to do that, I'll go to the File menu, down to Plugin Extras, and I'm going to select Perfect Photo Suite from the flyout menu. It'll launch here into the Perfect Photo Suite. You see over on the right-hand side is the layer stack, and we're starting in the Layers module. Layers is kind of like the home for the Perfect Photo Suite when you access it through Lightroom or as a standalone application. This is where in a layered workflow you would manage the different layers in your file, select which layers you want to work on in which modules. And you can actually do different things in different layers with different modules to achieve the look that you're going after. And that's really what I want to talk about today, is actually how to put layers to work for you. So the first thing I want to do is I want to replace this sky. To do that, I need to go find a sky that I wanted. So I keep a library of skies, and I shoot them all the time. Whenever I do get a beautiful looking day, and it tends to be when I'm driving in the car, I'll pull out my iPhone and I'll actually take a picture out the window. So I'm going to go back here to Layers, and here's a sky. Make it a little larger, that I just shot out the window of my car with my iPhone. You can see it's not very big. It's about 3,000 pixels, so it's only from about an 8 megapixel. The great thing about skies, though, is there's very little distinct detail in them, so you can take a fairly small sky, blow it up into a larger image, and you don't really suffer any problems from it. Plus, I tend to like to blur my skies anyway. So I select that sky layer, and I'm going to do just what I did before. We're going to go down to Plugin Extras, and we're going to send it to the Perfect Photo Suite. When you already have an image open in the suite in Layers and you send another file to it, it'll actually combine it together and let you add it as another layer. So I'm just going to select the Merge option right here, and this will insert that sky as a whole new layer. When you look at my layer stack, I now have 2 layers over here, and I can turn that sky on and off. The next step is I need to make that sky big enough to fill the image and position it so that the horizon lines match. It's very key when you look for a replacement sky to look for 2 things. The perspective that it's photographed at needs to be close. What you don't want to do is you don't want to have an image of a sky where you're pointing the camera straight up. It won't look realistic. So I always try to match the horizon lines between the shots. And then you want to get one that is within the realm of reality in terms of lighting and weather conditions. For example, I couldn't take a sunset and put a sunset behind this and have it look realistic, but these fluffy clouds I could probably get away with. So I'm going to use the Move tool or the Transform tool, the first tool in the tool well, and I'm just going to, in the tool options bar at the top, there's a great little button called Fill, and if I press that, it'll automatically size this layer to match my canvas size. So there we go. That'll size it up to where I want it to be, and then I'm just going to drag this up so that the horizon lines are about the same, right about there. There we go. We'll apply that. And now I'm going to drag the sky underneath my foreground so that it sits behind it. In the layer stack, you just click and drag. For those of you who are familiar with Photoshop, the type of things I'm doing right here are probably pretty familiar with. But for those of you who haven't used Photoshop, the power of a layered workflow is key to creating these type of images. And for those of you who have looked at the recent announcements from Adobe and have seen that to continue on with Photoshop is going to cost a monthly fee, I'm showing you a way to do what a lot of photographers do in Photoshop here inside the Perfect Photo Suite without the need for Photoshop. All right, so the next step in this process is I need to get rid of the boring blue sky in this shot to reveal the clouds underneath it. And there's a couple different ways to do that. The one that I'm going to use, the one that I like the most, is actually Perfect Mask. So right up here in the module selector, I'm going to click on Mask. The reason I like Mask is it's going to give me the most natural edge, and it's also the fastest one for doing it because it's got some cool technology built into it where all I have to do is kind of make a gesture through the area that I want to get rid of. So I'm just going to start with the drop brush right here. And watch, all I do is I'm just going to kind of brush a red stroke through the sky of what I want to get rid of. It's going to automatically expand that selection to all of the colors and areas that match, and voila, I'm pretty much done. It's already done all the work for me in knocking out that entire sky and blending it in. I'm just going to hit apply, and we'll go back to layers. Now, in looking at it where I've got my foreground and my sky, there's a little too much white behind the lighthouse. I really kind of want more of the blue sky behind the lighthouse. So we're just going to flip it. So if I go back down to this sky layer, I'll select that transform tool again, and up here in the tool options bar, remember where I hit that fill button to size it, there's also buttons to rotate it and flip the image. So I just want to flip it horizontally. There we go. So that puts more of the blue behind the lighthouse. The lighthouse being white, we want to have a different color behind us so it stands out a bit better. All right. The next step is I want to do just a little bit of cleanup on my foreground image. This is pretty raw out of the camera, and if we zoom in here a little bit, we'll see that there's some flaws that we're going to need to clean up. We'll notice that there's a couple pieces of dust, and because this was a really long exposure, like I said, over a minute long, you'll start to get some little colored Christmas tree light noise that we want to clean up. To clean that, we're going to use the retouch brush. The retouch brush lives right above the red eye tool. And all we're going to do is just dab it over the things that we want to get rid of, and it'll automatically fill those areas in. So I'm just going to dab on any annoying little spots that I see. There's actually a little piece of dust right there on my sensor. So let's just scrub around the image a little bit and look for any little spots that we need to clean up. I'm probably not going to grab all of them, but just enough so that you can see how this tool works. It's very simple. You just dab it on the things you want to clean up. And as long as it's a small, isolated object, it's very quick to clean up with this. When you get something larger, like in this case, I've got some people in the shot that I don't want, I'm going to enable the Use Clone Brush option up here at the top. The clone brush works by stamping one area of the image over another part of the image. So you have to set where you want to clone from to where you want to clone to. And again, you guys who have used Photoshop are familiar with this concept, but for those of you who haven't seen it, let me show you how it works. Start off by positioning your brush over the source, the part you want to copy from. So I want to copy from pixels right here. Hold down the Option key and click, and that'll set that area as our source. And then I'm just going to move my mouse over, and this lets me paste right over the top with those pixels. So there we go. That's cleaned up most of the distracting areas in my image. I'm also going to move up, and I'm just going to verify the mask on the lighthouse. It looks pretty good to me, except if we zoom in a little bit closer, there's this ugly railing and fence right here that I don't want. So we'll just grab the masking brush, and I'm going to make my brush a little bit smaller, and we're just going to add to the mask that was generated by Perfect Mask to remove this little bit of fence right here. So all I do is with the masking brush, just paint right along. So there we go. That'll let us clean up that. And I think there might be maybe just a little bits of noise here in this guy. And if I turn on the Perfect Brush option while I do this, we'll talk more about the Perfect Brush here in a little bit. This will help me clean up any noise left over in the mask. There we go. Perfect. All right, so we've replaced the sky. We've cleaned up the foreground. Now we're going to get to the step where we want to convert this to black and white. Looks like I got a couple questions here from Liz, so hold on.
All right, you guys, I'm back. It looks like there are a whole bunch of questions that are popping up in the questions panel. If you guys do have anything that you want to know about what Dan's doing right now, feel free to ask those. And I'm going to be giving some of these questions to Dan while he's working so he can continue doing what he's doing and he's not paying attention to all of the questions that pop up. So it looks like we had a question about inside Perfect Mask, why did it only take the sky away and why did it not take away the water that's down on the ground?
That's a great question. The way that Perfect Mask works is when it starts up, it looks at the image and it breaks it into segments of like color and texture. Think of it, kind of turns the image into like a jigsaw puzzle. And when I painted across the sky with the drop brush, I was saying anything that is touching these brush strokes and looks like the area underneath these brush strokes are the part that we want to get rid of. So it intelligently figured out what the border was. And obviously along the lighthouse and along the rocks at the top, was a pretty obvious edge. But towards the bottom left corner where we were at the horizon line, there's enough of a natural line there that the segmentation algorithm knew that that was an edge and knew not to get down into the areas of the water at the bottom.
All right, and then it looks like we've got a couple of questions about how you would change the feather amount and the brush size in the brushes inside perfect layers.
Sure. So to control the brush, I'm just going to select the masking brush here, and at the top in the tool options bar, it contains all of the options for whatever tool you have selected. And when you have a brush selected, the options are almost always the same. There's an option for controlling the brush mode. That's whether you're painting in or painting out, or for those of you who are used to Photoshop, it's whether I'm painting with black paint or painting with white paint. And let's just turn on our mask view here for a second. So down the bottom left corner of the preview, you can actually preview what the mask looks like on the layer. And there's several different ways to view it. The one that I'm going to use is the traditional grayscale mask view. So anything that is white, we're showing the layer. Anything that is black, we're hiding on the layer. So on the layer with the lighthouse in the image, we're hiding everything that was in the sky. That's all the area that's black. If I wanted to hide more of the shot, all I would do is I would take my brush, make sure the mode is set to paint out, that means paint in black, and then I would just paint over the things I don't want. And I actually have the perfect brush enabled. We'll talk about that here in just a minute. But you can see I can retouch on that mask to remove things, and this is basically painting away that lighthouse if I didn't want it in the shot. So if we go back and we look at this without the mask, you'll see how we painted away the lighthouse. I'm going to undo that here because I kind of want to have the lighthouse. Now, in terms of controlling some of the other options, you can adjust the size of the brush, the feather of the brush, that's basically how hard the brush is, and the opacity of the brush with these three pop-ups. And there's several different ways to control these. The first way is to click on the little downward-facing triangle. It'll bring up a slider, and you can adjust the slider. The easier way is to use the built-in scrubby sliders. And if you're used to Photoshop, you're used to scrubby sliders. All you do is you bring the mouse over the name of the control, and you notice that cursor turns into little arrows, and you can then click and drag to the left or right to increase or decrease the brush size or change any of these parameters. Or if you're used to using your keyboard shortcuts, you can use the bracket keys on your keyboard. So you can use the right bracket to make your brush bigger and the left to make your brush smaller. And that's typically what I use most often. You also notice there's a little W next to these. That's for a Wacom tablet. If you're using a Wacom pressure sensitive tablet, if you turn this checkbox on, so basically if the little W is turned on, as you press harder with your pen, the brush will get bigger automatically. So you can control the brush size by the pressure of your tablet. Same thing for feather, same thing for opacity. Alrighty, hopefully that answers some of the questions on how to control the brush. Let's move on here. What I want to do is really talk about one of the benefits of working in layers, and that's that you can send each layer to a different plugin, or if you think about it even a step past that, it lets me control each layer separately. So I can use different techniques for different parts of the image. So what I want to do is I want to take my sky. Remember I mentioned that this was shot with an iPhone. The iPhone is a great handy pocket camera, but it's also very noisy. So you notice when we look at the sky, when we zoom in, there's a lot of noise in that sky, and that noise doesn't really match the rest of the image. And noise in a sky is going to cause me problems further down the road. When I start to add more effects to it, that noise is going to become more and more obvious. So the first thing I want to do is I want to get rid of that noise. A quick way to do that on a sky is to just simply blur it, because there's not a lot of detail in the sky that I want to preserve. And because we're kind of going for this long exposure look, the sky would actually be a little fuzzy in the first place because those clouds would be moving. So to blur it, I'm going to use focal point or the focus module. So up here in the upper right, I'm just going to click on focus. There's also blurring tools inside of Perfect Effects, but I like the lens blur algorithm that's in focal point. To me, it's the most realistic looking blur that we have. So we'll load up focal point. You'll notice that the sky is blurred, but the foreground is not. The preview actually shows us the layer that we're working on, which is the sky, but leaves the layer that we're not working on untouched. So we can actually control the blur and all these options without having any effect on the foreground at all. So we can control the amount of blur right here with the amount slider. Typically, you only need a small amount of blur. I'm going to use like 4 or 5, just enough to take the edge off the noise. And if we zoom in, we want to take a look at that noise pattern that we were looking at over here in the sky. Make sure that's softened, which it is. And we also want to maybe darken the sky a little bit. Let's actually just reset the brightness and contrast controls down here at the bottom. We can also darken and increase the contrast in that sky. So by grabbing the brightness slider, bringing it down, it'll darken those blues. And if I grab the contrast slider and I bring it up, it'll clean up the whites in the clouds. So it makes that sky stronger. Now, some of you who are more seasoned eyes are probably looking at this and saying, well, that sky doesn't match at all, color-wise. Let's not worry about that because we're actually going to be converting the whole scene to black and white, so it doesn't matter. Let's go ahead and I'm going to apply this. So that'll turn our sky a little softer and a little darker. It returns us back to layers. Now the next step is actually to start to work on our black and white conversion. And again, because these are separate layers, I can do the conversion differently for different parts of the image. I can use different options for the sky than I want to for the foreground. So let's go ahead and we'll go to perfect black and white and we'll work on our sky first. Here we go. Here we are in perfect black and white, and you'll notice the only part that's actually turning black and white in this case is the sky, because the foreground's on its own layer. What I want to do in my black and white conversion for the sky is a fairly basic conversion. All I want to do is make sure that the blues in the sky kind of have a nice dark color to them, like I was using a red filter over my camera lens. Easy way to do that is just to click the red filter option right here. That will darken those blues, turn them almost black, and gives me a very dramatic looking sky. That's all I really have to do. I'm going to hit apply. We'll go back and then we'll do the conversion for the foreground, which is a little trickier. Now keep in mind, if you're using this technique where you're using different conversions for different parts of the image, you want to make sure that if you're using any film grain or any glow or any toners, that you use them the same in both settings or they won't match. For example, if I used a toner on the sky and didn't use a toner on the foreground, you'd see an obvious color difference. So in this case, I'm using no toner. I'm doing a very traditional black and white. Now we'll just move up on our layer stack. We'll grab the foreground with the lighthouse. We'll go to black and white, and we'll do the final conversion there. There we go. Now to help me pick out the conversion that I want to use, we'll use the new Quick View browser. The Quick View browser is located in the browser panel on the left-hand side. You can use it in layers or any module that uses a preset. And it gives you a great way to actually preview all the different options that you have. You can access it by clicking this little button down here in the footer of the browser, or you'll notice it lives on each folder as well. I'm just going to go ahead and click it here in the footer. This will bring up a full screen view of all of the categories that I have to choose from. Let's make this a little bit larger with the slider. So these are the categories, and when I click inside of a category, it'll show me all of the effects that live inside of that category. I'm going to go to the 21st Century Modern Digital category. Let's again make that a little bit larger, and it actually lets me preview those settings on my image. Now you notice it's applying to the entire image, so we see the old sky in there. It actually doesn't use the mask just for previewing these. I'm just going to go through until I find one that I like. I'm going to use this one called Modern. And when I click on that, it'll apply those settings, and my image is automatically adjusted. Now this is looking pretty good to me, except I really want the water in the foreground to be brighter and whiter. I really want it to kind of mimic the sky a bit more. So I'm just going to paint some brightness into the water. To do that, we'll use the brightness brush up here at the top. It's the first tool in my tool well. I'm going to make sure that my perfect brush is engaged. I'm going to make it a little bit stronger. I'm going to go about 35 or so. Make my brush larger here. And now I'm just going to paint across the water. Now the cool thing about the perfect brush is it's going to detect the original color in the image, and it's going to limit my lightening to just the water area. So as I paint, you'll notice that it's lightening the water, but it's not going to lighten the rocks around it. So watch here as we start to paint, we can actually paint more lightness into the water. I always feel like I should hum while I'm painting, so it's not as boring for you guys watching me. But I'm a horrible hummer. Liz, Liz could hum, maybe. That's too much to ask.
It's all right. I'll start humming. I can start humming the Star Spangled Banner or chopsticks. That's what I got.
Chopsticks?
Yeah. Now, you guys, while Dan is doing a whole bunch of his work, don't forget you have a chance to ask a whole bunch of questions about what he's doing and also other parts about the suite. So keep those questions coming because we'd love to keep on answering those. It looks like we've got a couple coming in, and I'm answering a few as they come. So just while he's doing his down moments and he's brushing a whole bunch, you've got a chance to do that. So don't forget to ask those questions, you guys.
All right, so you notice we lighten up the water. I'm just going to use the undo option here. I'm just going to do a Command Z or Control Z if you're on a Windows keyboard, just so we can kind of look at the before and the after of lightening up that water. So there's before, and there's after. So just enough to lighten up that water in the foreground so that it kind of matches the sky a bit more. So we get this repetition of light, dark in the image. Alrighty, let's apply those results. Now, up until this point, everything we've done have been on separate layers. At this point, we'll actually merge this together and we'll create a new stamped layer. And this allows us to work on the image as a whole, but we can always go ahead and throw that away and continue to work on just an individual layer if we want to. So when we come back to layers here, there we go. I want to create one layer that has everything together on it. And there's a command in the layer menu called New Stamped Layer. And this will create a new layer that merges all the layers underneath into one layer on its own. So now, if I can turn off everything else here, you'll see how I have one layer that has everything on it. Now if I want to go in and do more work, it'll affect the entire image at once. So if I wanted to add a toner, for example, if I wanted to add a border to it, now I can do that and have it affect the entire image. But if I decide later on that I needed to make a change in my layered workflow, all I do is I just throw that layer away and I can go back and continue to work on the image on its own. All right, any questions out there, Liz, before we move to our next image?
Yeah, so it looks like we've got some good questions, and there are a couple about the perfect brush and how it works. Let me find it. There are a lot of questions coming in, you guys, which is great. So if you're using the brush and you want to add more lightning, how would you do that? Do you just click again, or do you have to start over with another brush, or how does the perfect brush work, and how can you continue to lighten or darken areas?
Sure. So in that example in black and white, if I wanted to continue to lighten that, all I would do is I would just paint over it again. As you paint, it continues to build up until you get a basically 100% opacity. That would be the maximum brightness that you could add to that area. If you make a really big mistake, then you could just reset your brushing and paint it again, but generally you would just paint over it multiple times to continue to lighten it.
All right, there was a question about whether you could add a border to your black and white photo inside Perfect Black and White.
Sure. Let's actually show you how to do that. Let's go ahead. I'm going to go back to black and white. Actually, you can do it in black and white, but you can also do it in effects as well. But let's just show you in black and white.
We need more humming, Dan. We got to come up with some good songs that you can hum while it loads.
I just need a faster computer or smaller images, I guess.
I was going to say you need a DJ.
So let's go down. I'm going to go to the Borders pane, and we'll open that up and turn it on. And there's tons of different borders that you can select to add to your image. Now, one thing I will notice, and this was actually my mistake, is I forgot to crop the image. So there's actually canvas or excuse me, pixels outside of the canvas area. So that's why the top of this is cut off. So you'll encounter this occasionally when you work with multi-layered files and you move layers underneath the canvas. It's an easy fix. We'll just go back here to layers and we'll grab the crop tool, and I'm just going to say fit to canvas and apply that. And that will trim any pixels outside of the canvas that we don't want. We keep those there so that if you want to move those layers around in the future, you can always get them back. But we also operate on everything in the image inside of a module. So that's why the top of the border was cut off, because it was basically outside of the canvas area. Let's go back to black and white.
Dun, 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 dun. Pow!
Right.
Making it more exciting.
Making it more exciting. Borders aren't exciting enough. So we'll turn the borders on. From the category pop-up, you can pick the category of borders you want. For something like this, I would probably go with, let's do maybe a film edge. And I want to, from the border type, we can pick what we want. And I'm actually going to do a nice large format, one like it was shot on a 4x5 camera. So you actually get the authentic edge from 4x5 film added to it, just like that. And if we wanted to make that just a little bit larger so that we don't have any of that white edge to it, so the film just touches the edge, we'll just grab that size slider and bring it up 1, maybe 2. There we go, just to soften the edge. So that's how you'd add a border inside of black and white. You can also add a vignette, you can add toner, you can add film grain, you can add glows, you can do all sorts of things in black and white. I'm a bit of a traditionalist, so I only used a few of the different tools in black and white, and there's tons of video tutorials on using black and white on our website as well. All right, any other questions before we move on?
Why don't you move on, and you guys keep those questions coming, and we'll ask some more questions to Dan in the next couple of minutes after he's done doing his next thing.
All right, so there were some questions about the perfect brush. So let's actually talk a bit more about using the perfect brush. I'm just going to close this image and not save it so that it'll be a little faster. Let's go back to Lightroom and let's show you how to actually take advantage of the perfect brush a bit more. I'm just going to select my image. We'll send it to the suite. Come on, Lightroom. There we go. All right, so this is a great case of using the perfect brush. Another one of those cases where it's interesting foreground, but just a boring blue sky. It's either a boring blue or boring white sky. I typically want to replace it. So we'll actually use some of the built-in backgrounds that come with the suite. So in the Perfect Photo Suite, in the Layers module, you notice in the Browser tab, there's a Browser and Extras. If you click on Extras, there's all sorts of backgrounds and borders and textures that we give you with the suite that you can use as part of your images. So let's go ahead and we'll go to the Backgrounds category here. We'll just use the Quick View browser again to make this easy. Let's go to my Backgrounds and then into the skies category. You can see there's inside pictures and studio backgrounds and lots of grungy walls that are great for textures, or if you want to cut somebody out and put them on a studio background. All of those elements live here. For me, I use the skies all the time, so I'm just going to open up the skies folder here and we'll browse through all of the included skies that come with the suite. So let's go through and find one that kind of matches that image. Now remember what we mentioned before, we want to make sure that it's shot from about the same perspective so that the horizon lines will match up and that it's believable in terms of the weather conditions and the lighting for the time of day. So for me, I think this shot right here will actually do a great job. So you just click on it, we'll add it as a new layer. We'll use that transform tool like we did before to fit it to our image. And then we're just going to move it up so that the bottom of the image is at about where the horizon line in my shot would be. So right about here. And just like before, we want to make sure we stick it underneath the image. There we go. And now we just need to get rid of this boring blue sky so that we can see the sky underneath it. And we could do this in mask, but instead, on this time, let's use the perfect brush. So I'm going to grab the masking brush, and we're just going to make sure the perfect brush option is enabled. What the perfect brush does is it's kind of smart masking. As I paint, it's sampling the color underneath the center of the brush, and it's only going to paint away colors that match that. So, normally without the perfect brush turned on, if I was to paint through here to reveal that sky, it's great until I get down to the tough stuff along this rough edge with the trees. I would have to zoom in super close and paint really accurately through those trees to try to do that kind of blending. And to be honest, you would spend the rest of your life trying to make it look realistic. The perfect brush, on the other hand, makes it really easy. All we do is we turn that perfect brush on, and now as you start to paint, it's going to just sample the color underneath. You notice my brush is covering both the sky and the foreground, the ridge in the foreground. And as I paint, it's only painting away the sky. It's leaving the foreground untouched. There we go. So as long as there's a color difference between my foreground and my background, I can just brush right along it here with the perfect brush. Even through something like this tree, I can just paint right through the tree, and it will automatically paint away just the sky colors. While I'm doing this here, I'm actually going to turn on the grayscale mask so you can actually see what this looks like. So you can see the edge that it's creating. And as I paint along here, let me make my brush just a little larger. As I paint along the edge, you see how it's painting away the sky, but keeping all those little trees, and it does it all automatically for me, just like that. Let's go back, and I'm going to show you a great new feature that just came out in Suite 7.5. In addition to the perfect brush, I'm going to zoom in over here on this tree. Now, it would be hard to paint through this tree normally because we would end up accidentally hitting some of the greens or some of the colors of the branches, and we'd inadvertently start to paint away the tree. See, if I tried to get tricky and paint in here, I'm accidentally hit the tree and it starts to paint it away. We don't want to do that. What I really want to be able to do is lock the color that I'm trying to paint away. I'm just going to undo that. And you can now lock that color by holding down, on the Mac you hold down the Command key, on a Windows computer you hold down the Control key while you're painting with the perfect brush, and it locks the color that you just sampled. So I can start to paint out here. Now I'm going to hold down my Command key, and as I paint through the tree, it's only painting away the last color that I sampled, just like that. Another handy thing to know is when you're using the perfect brush, the feather option right up here controls how soft that edge is. And if we're using the perfect brush to go through a very intricate area, like a tree like this, we want to use a very small amount of feather. I actually made a mistake. I used a feather that was too high, and it ended up softening the tree too much. So I'm just going to step back through my history. There we go. And let's turn our feather down to only about 1 or 2, just enough to kind of anti-alias the edge, but not paint away the tree. Now let's go through and do that same action again. Now you can see how it's getting rid of the colors in the tree, of the colors of the sky in the tree, but leaving all the needles behind. And if we reveal that mask again here, let's go ahead and show the mask. You can see how it's left the tree intact. All right, so there we go. We have our new sky in place. Now we're ready to go in and do another black and white conversion. I'm kind of a big fan of black and white, so we'll spend some extra time there today. Now before I do that, I want to again create one of those merged layers where the foreground and background are now merged, so I can operate them on them together. So we'll go to the layer menu, we'll select new stamped layer. That'll merge them together. Now you could just merge these two layers together, but then I could never go back and change the sky again without having to start over. By creating a new merged layer, like I just did here, I can always throw that away, go back, change my sky, or change my mask if I make a mistake. I'm also going to crop this again so we don't have any extraneous pixels underneath my canvas. And then we'll go to black and white. All right. When we start out in black and white, it's always going to use kind of a default setting to help us get started. To me, this is a little too bright for this image. So I'm going to start off with the brightness slider, and I'm just going to bring that down a little bit. It helps if you look at your histogram. So up here, you can look at the histogram, and this will help you judge as you make changes. You can also turn on the clipping. This is a great advanced feature. You can click the little triangles in the upper corners, and this will highlight for you in the image what is white and what is black. So by enabling that, you can see anything that is blue is a real black. Anything that is red is a real white. So as you make changes to your brightness and your contrast, or your blacks and whites and highlights and shadows, you'll actually see how those changes affect your image. Now, I actually do like this image to be a bit darker. Having some real blacks in the image is good. That's what builds real contrast. So I'm not worried about darkening this a little bit. And I think everything else actually is about where I want it to be from an overall tonality. I have just a little bit of whites in the sky, so I've got a full contrast range, and I've only clipped just a little bit of the blacks. The next step is I want to darken that sky. An easy way to do that is to grab the targeted brightness tool, which is the fourth tool down in black and white. You click on that, and then all you do is you click on the color in the scene that you want to make lighter or darker. If I want to darken the sky, I just click in the sky, and then if I drag to the left, it'll make the blues darker. If I drag to the right, it'll make it brighter. So I just click in the sky and I just drag to the left, and it's going to automatically darken that sky up for me. I can control how much just by moving that slider around. There we go. That looks pretty good. The next thing we want to do is I really just kind of want to darken this whole big rock area in the foreground. To do that, again, we'll just grab our brightness brush. I'm going to toggle it from lighten to darken. And I'm going to turn the perfect brush off for this. Make my brush a little bit larger. And then all I'm going to do is I'm just going to paint this whole foreground area in just to make it a little bit darker. Because I'm using a nice large soft brush for this, I don't have to be super accurate about my brushing either. Just enough to kind of burn those areas down. And if you're experienced in the darkroom, you kind of understand the concept of what we're doing here. We're just burning down that foreground to even it out. There we go. And now, the last thing I want to do is I want to paint a little bit more detail into this big boulder in the foreground. That's really the center of interest in this image, is this boulder. So we'll use the detail brush. We're going to make sure it's set to more detail, about 20. We'll make our brush a little bit bigger, and then we'll paint in here. And detail is going to increase the detail or the structure. Sometimes it's called the tonal contrast in the image. And this will just really make that rock pop out even more. There we go, just like that. So let's go ahead and take a look at the before and the after. You can always view your before image by toggling the preview switch down here at the bottom. It's also the Command P or Control P keyboard shortcut. So there's before our color image, and then after our black and white image. Very classic black and white. All right, any questions on black and white before we move on?
There we go. The microphone turned off there for a second, but we're back. It looks like there were a couple questions about partially black and white and partially perfect layers, how you undid your process or how you access some form of a history. So how would you undo something that you didn't like?
So the way you would undo something you didn't like, and that's the great thing about a layered workflow, is you just simply delete the layer that you don't like. So let's say I've got to this point and I realize, gosh, I really want a different sky in this shot. All I would do is, let me jump out of here real fast. We'll go back to layers. All I do is I throw away that merge duplicate layer that I have on the top, and I'm back right where I was, where I have my foreground and background separated, and I can now change my sky. Let's say I want to move that sky around a little bit. I could grab that and move it, or maybe I want to flip it. So let's flip it left to right. So there we go. We can make those sorts of changes. Then we just go back and redo the work. We create the new composite layer and send it off to black and white. That's one of the great things about a layered workflow, is it gives you the ability to step back through complex tasks. These are much more complex tasks than something like Lightroom or Aperture does in their non-destructive workflow. They're working on a very small number of things, only on a single image. There's no combining of multiple images together.
All right, and then there were also, it looks like there are a couple questions about how this stamped layer is going to affect the final results of your image. So is it going to make your photo a lot larger? You're going to have to deal with issues like that. And when you bring it back into Lightroom, are you still going to have access to these layers?
Mm-hmm. Two great questions. By creating new layers, it is going to make your file size larger. That's okay. Hard drive space is cheap. So I have no problem having lots of layers in my file as long as it gives me those ability to roll back. The other question about seeing it in Lightroom, what you see in Lightroom when we apply and save things is exactly what you see here on your screen. And as long as you access that Photoshop file correctly through Lightroom, you'll maintain all of those layers. What you want to be careful of is in Lightroom or in Aperture, if you make changes in the develop module to a Photoshop file after you've done this kind of work, and then you say, I want to edit a copy with the Lightroom options applied, that's a signal that it's going to flatten that image. You're going to lose all of your layers. So when you go to a Photoshop workflow and you're working on Photoshop layered files, you want to make sure that you do all of your work past that in another tool other than Lightroom. You can use Lightroom for managing the files, but you don't want to use it for actually editing the file, because as soon as you do that, you're going to nuke all your layers. All right, let's close out this image. And I have one more example that we'll do today. Let's actually do one that stays in color, because we've done a couple black and white ones already. We're going to talk about merging a couple different exposures together from the same scene. Now, a lot of cases you would do this with HDR, but I want to show you how you can do it without using HDR. So I have two exposures, one where I exposed correctly for the sky, and then one where I exposed more for the foreground. And we're just going to merge these two shots together. One of the great things about doing this is you don't get the ghosting. When you do HDR, you have a longer exposure for the clouds that gets blended in, and a lot of times you'll get ghosting in the clouds, and the clouds won't look quite right. This way you get the actual clouds that you started with. So to merge these two together, I can actually select multiple files at the same time and send it to the suite. So I'm going to select both of those, and we'll send these to the suite. It will then stack those together inside of the layers module. So we'll give it a second here it has to process. These are both raw files from my Canon. So it'll take Lightroom a second to generate copies of those. It's still thinking.
Now, while it's thinking really quickly, I've got a second to ask him a question. There was one that came in about whether you can open up PSD files inside the suite without having to use Photoshop. So is that possible? You can do that, or do you have to use Photoshop to be able to use a PSD file?
No, you can definitely open PSD files directly through the suite. We share the same Photoshop file as our file format. Now, depending on the work that you've done in Photoshop, there's certain layer types that we're not going to be able to support. So if you have a text layer, or you've put in adjustment layers or smart objects, those are file formats or layers types that we're not going to understand. So you'll still be able to open that Photoshop file, but it'll be flattened. You won't have all of the layers in it. But if you're dealing with simple layers, simple layer masks, you can edit those back and forth between Photoshop and Perfect Layers, no problems. All right, let us see what we're going to do here. We want to blend in the darker sky. So to do that, I'm just going to take my sky layer, I'm going to stick it up here on the top, and we're going to use the masking bug. The masking bug is a flexible gradient mask tool. Normally, you could use a brush, but a brush is very hard to create an even straight line with. The masking bug, on the other hand, gives us a very simple gradient. Let me actually turn on the mask so you can see how the masking bug works. It's a simple gradient tool. We can control the size and the angle. You can also control the hardness on the edge and its overall opacity as well, all from this masking bug control. There's a square shape that we're using right here. There's also a little round shape as well. Let's just go back to viewing all those layers. And what I want to do is I want to place it on the foreground so that we're revealing the properly exposed foreground with the sky from the other layer on top. Another handy mask mode is the mask red option. This actually shows you the mask in red, like a rubylith mask. And this allows you to see the thickness of the transition and the exact position of it. So it makes it easy for us to decide exactly where we want that mask to be placed. So there we go. That was a very quick way for us to blend those two exposures together. We've blended the sky from the darker exposure and the foreground from the lighter exposure together. All right, now here's where it gets really fun. What I want to do is I want to take the reflection of the clouds and place them into these little reflecting pools in the foreground. So to do that, what I want to do is I need to take a copy of this sky and put it underneath these, and then what we'll do is we'll mask through these pools. So we're going to take the upper layer. Remember, the upper layer is the one that has our clouds on it. I'm going to copy it. I'm going to put that copy underneath everything, so it's at the very bottom of my stack. Let's just turn those upper two layers off for a second. So all we're looking at is that layer that we copied. I'm going to reset its mask. So basically we want to remove its mask. So we'll hit the reset button in the masking pane. And then with the transform tool, I want to flip this thing upside down. So we can flip it by using the flip button. So that now gives us a mirrored reflection of the sky. And let's just stretch it now so that it'll be underneath the rocks in the foreground. There we go. Cool. Let's go ahead and turn our upper layers back on. There we go. Now, all we need to do is just use our masking brush to paint on these little pools of water, and we'll start to see the clouds, what appear to be reflecting in those. So let's grab our masking brush. I'm going to make sure my perfect brush option is turned on. That's what's going to make this actually work for us so that we don't have to paint incredibly precise. It'll automatically just work in those reflected areas. And I'm going to turn my opacity down a little bit. I really only want an opacity of about 50% because I want to blend the clouds in. I don't want to completely paint these holes away with the water. I just want to soften them up a little bit. All right. That's a lot of setup, so let's actually show you how this works now. So now, as I start to paint, you'll see how we start to see a little bit of the clouds starting to appear in those reflections in the water. Oops, I got a little too close and hit a rock on accident. That's where holding down that command key or control key can be helpful so that you don't accidentally make mistakes like that. You can see how the selection just automatically grows as we paint with the perfect brush enabled. There we go. I'm not going to paint every single one of those holes, but now watch, if I turn that layer off, you can actually see where we've painted in that mask. I can actually paint through here a little bit too. So that helps us add in that bit of a reflection of our new sky and makes it look realistic. All right. Any questions so far? Okay.
Let's go ahead and move on to perfect effects. It looks like it's about 9:53, everybody, here on the Pacific Coast. So we are going to be ending the webinar around 10 o'clock-ish. So Dan's going to go into perfect effects, and then we're going to pop back and he'll answer a couple more questions, and then we'll be done with the webinar. So if you've got any last questions, feel free to ask those now so we can get to those right at the end.
All right. I'm going to go ahead and we'll use that new stamp layer command one more time here to create a copy of everything up to this point. And we'll trim it just to make sure we don't have any extra pixels sitting outside the canvas that we don't care about. And then we'll go into perfect effects, and I just want to enhance this sunset and make it look a little bit warmer. So let's go ahead, we'll go to effects. Now there's a ton of different ways that we can do this. I'm actually going to use a preset that I created called, what the heck is it called? Is it Tijuana Sunrise, I think? Yeah, Tijuana Sunrise. Now this thing is super strong when you add it. We're not going to use it at the full strength. We'll always use the amount slider right here to dial this back to a more modest setting. So we'll just grab that slider, we'll pull it back, and see it just lets you dial in just the amount of that strong warmth that you want. So I'm only going to use it at about 30–35% here. There we go. Just enough to add a little bit of warmth. Let's turn that on and off. So there's before and there's after. And to be honest, that's all I probably do in the shot. We could probably add maybe a little bit of detail to the foreground as well. Let's go ahead. I'm just going to add a new empty layer. Let's use the tonal contrast effect. That's one I use a lot. Now, if you're well versed in effects and you know what you're looking for, you can just use the search field at the top to find the things that you want to use. You can also mark it as a favorite by clicking on the little flag right here, and then when you look in your favorites folder, you'll see your favorite effects. That way it's a quick way to find just the ones you're interested in. However, if you're learning effects, using the Quick View browser is probably the best way to work. So we'll just click that Quick View browser button. This will actually then show us our image with every category of effects. You can then scroll through those categories and find something that's in the neighborhood of what you're interested in. Let's say I'm going to go to, we'll put a texture over this just for texture's sake, because it's easy to talk about what we're doing. Let's go to the texture walls category. You can always make these bigger or smaller using the plus or minus key or using the slider on your keyboard. And it lets you preview those textures or preview any effect on top of your image, and then all you have to do is click on it to actually add it to the image. So let's say I want to add this warm concrete to it. You just click and it will then add that effect right on top. There we go. And again, that's amount slider controls how strong the overall effect is. Just like that. Now, that's not one I would want to use on this. We want to use that tonal contrast effect that helps us bring out some of the detail in those foreground rocks. So I'll just use the search field. We'll type in tonal contrast. We'll add that. We can use the amount slider to control how strong the effect is again. I don't want it as that strong. I only want it at about 30 or 40. And I only want it on the bottom half. I don't want it on the top half. So we'll use the masking bug again. We'll select it and we'll click over what we want to hide, in this case the sky. There we go. Let's bring that up and turn it, and that way we're applying that tonal contrast effect only to the foreground and the clouds don't get it at all. Just like that. So let's take a look at before and after. Let me hit the tab key on my keyboard. That'll hide the left and right drawer so we see just the image on its own. And then we can use the keyboard shortcut Command P or Control P to see our before and our after. Just like that. Alrighty. That's about all I had planned for you guys today. Are there any other questions we can answer?
So it looks like there was a question about what you were doing with the perfect brush when you said you were holding down the Command key.
Okay. So let's go back and grab that image so that we can look at that so you can see. We were doing that in layers. Now, the perfect brush option is available in also in layers, in portrait, in black and white, in effects. Anywhere you can use a brush to mask, you can also use the perfect brush option for that automatic edge detection. So if I wanted to paint an effect in Perfect Effects and only have it affect a certain portion of the image, the perfect brush is a great tool for doing that as well. Where we've looked at it today so far has actually been in perfect layers. And what the holding down the command key or holding down the control key does is it stops the sampling. So as you move the perfect brush, it normally is always sampling the color underneath the center of it. By holding down that modifier key, it'll stop the sampling. So let's grab that image again so we can take a look at it. Take just a second for it to open up in the suite.
Mush sweet. Much like you're in the Iditarod.
There we go. So let's grab that perfect brush. I'm going to zoom in here closer, and we'll take a look at this tree. Let me bring my opacity all the way up, and we'll bring my feather down. So as you paint with the perfect brush, whatever is underneath that little minus symbol in the center of it, that's the color that it's going to paint away. And as the brush moves, it's constantly tracking whatever that color is under the center of the brush to paint it away. So if I was painting through here, you'll see how it is automatically painting away the blue sky, and as I continue to move, it continues to resample that color. And that's great as long as I have a hard edge that isn't intricate. But if you have something that's intricate like the tree, I can't just paint through the tree because at some point the center of my brush is going to touch the tree. So you notice as I keep brushing, it's doing a good job of getting rid of the blue until the second that the center of my brush touches the green. And oh no, now I'm starting to paint away tree. I don't want to do that. So holding down that command key or the control key when I get to the edge of the tree will tell it, hey, stop sampling color, just use whatever the last color was that you had and use that. So let's step back here. And now as I paint through, I'm not holding down the command key or the control key yet, but as soon as I get right here to the edge, I'm just going to reach over with my other little finger. I'm going to hold down the command key, and now I can paint through the tree, and you can see how it only uses the colors that were on the edge. It doesn't paint away the tree itself. You can always let go of that key and click it again to resample the color again. So maybe I'm going to start here in the inside of the tree and I'll start painting, and this will help me to clean up some of those darker colors up there in the upper branches, just like that. So hopefully that explained kind of when you use that ability to lock the color using the command or the control key.
All right, it also looks like there was a question about how you would add your own skies when you're in perfect layers and you go to the extras category and you get access to all of those guys. How would you add one of your own from perfect layers?
All right, so there's two different ways that you can track your own skies or your own textures with the suite. The first way to do it is to keep track of it in whatever workflow tool you use, like Lightroom Rapture. That's actually what I do, is I have categories in Lightroom that are full of nothing but skies. And like you saw, in Lightroom, it's easy to send a new layer to the suite while I'm working. So while I'm working on this image, if I wanted to add this sky to it, I just select that, and we go over here to plugin extras, and we send it to the suite, and it's going to know, hey, I'm trying to add this as a layer. So I just click merge, and it'll add that new layer in here. I'm zoomed in really far, so it looks kind of weird. There we go. So you can always just manage it with the workflow tool that you use. The other way to do it is you can use the built-in browser here inside of Perfect Effects. So you notice there's an Extras tab and the Browser tab. In the Browsers tab, you can browse any logical folder structure on your computer. So you can just go up here to the File menu, go to Browse, and you can point it towards whatever folders you want to watch. So if you have a folder where you keep your skies, you can just go up to Browse, pick the folder where you keep your skies, and then you'll be able to browse it over here on the left, just like I can browse through these files. Let me turn on the thumbnails here so it's a little easier to see. But you can see all of these files, and if I double click on one of these files, it would just add that as well. So let's say I wanted to use the sky from this image instead. I just double click. It's going to, I was in the middle of something there. Let's add that as a new layer. And there we go. We've got another image added with a sky that we can use. Now, getting your skies into the extras folder to appear here, I don't recommend. It's actually not a supported thing to do. These folders are managed by the suite. And if you were to put your pictures here, when you update your version of the suite, they might get erased. So this is only the stuff that we provide that comes with it, and we are responsible for keeping track of it and making sure we don't do bad things to it. But if you put your own stuff there, we don't know about it, and when we do updates, your images might get deleted.
There was a question about when you crop off, when you're cropping the images and you're doing that fit to canvas, is that going to crop all of your layers, or is it just going to crop the active new stamped layer that you've created?
So you could do it either way, actually. The crop tool this one right here, will actually crop every layer in your document. That'll trim off everything, and that will resets the canvas size as well. The tool below that is called the trim tool. That's kind of unique to layers. They don't have this in Photoshop with a lot of other tools. It's like the crop tool, but only for an individual layer. So you can draw that on a layer, hit the trim tool, and anything outside of the box of the trim tool will be deleted, but just for that layer.
That makes sense. All right, now we're running out of time, and unfortunately, we're going to have to go. It's a little bit after 10 o'clock, so we're running past our end point here. But again, my name is Liz. We were here with Dan Harlacher. If you guys are interested in watching this webinar with Dan again, we're going to be uploading it to our YouTube site in the next day or so. So if you guys missed anything, like if you missed the beginning or your computer cut out for a little bit, you'll be able to go back and re-watch this again, which is really great. We also have an amazing lineup of webinars for the next week or two. So if you guys are interested in actually coming and seeing Dan do another webinar next Friday at 9 o'clock, it's all about how to use the compositing tools. So it looks like there are a lot of questions about how to use all of the different compositing tools, like how to access things like the perfect brush inside of layers and how to use all of the masking tools inside Perfect Mask. So if you guys are interested in that, show up next week at 9 o'clock for Dan's other How to Create Amazing Composites webinar. So thank you so much, Dan, for showing up today. It was wonderful that you did this webinar with us.
Thanks for having me.
With all of us, just me and all of you people that we can't actually see. So thank you so much for showing up today, you guys. If you guys have any more questions about the suite that we weren't able to answer today, feel free to send us an email. We've got great customer service. So you can call us or email us and let us know what's going on, and we can help you out. And I hope you guys all have a wonderful afternoon.